Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of All In, the Sustainable Business Podcast. I'm David Grayson, and I'm here today with a very exciting guest, Farwiza Farhan. We're both doing this recording whilst in Southeast Asia. I'm on the island of Borneo, and Farwiza is on the island, I think, of Sumatra at the moment. And that's where you're based. And since 2012, have been doing some amazing work in the Leuser in the Leuser ecosystem, which I'll ask Farwiza in a moment to explain in some more detail. But as I understand it, I've never been there, sadly, but it's an area about the size of Rwanda, or for listeners or viewers in Europe, it's about the size of Wales, and it is one of the most precious rainforests on Earth. But of course, like other rainforests, it's challenged by the pressures of economic development. And Farwiza has been working since 2012 to try to maintain this very precious resource for humankind. Farwiza, you live in part of Aceh, part of Sumatra. When did you first realize that the rainforest was such an important resource?
Thank you, David, for the opportunity to join you in your podcast and for that very important question. Interestingly, for me, growing up in this area, I have always have a penchant towards nature. I love being outside. I spend a lot of time climbing trees. I spend a lot of time swimming in the river and in the ocean. And as a kid, I take it for granted that nature is there and it's accessible and it's reliable and it's always clean. And that's kind of like the mindset where I come in. And then I begin watching documentaries, nature documentaries. Sometimes in like BBC Blue Planet, for example, you see they show beautiful underwater pictures, but they also show the problems that the world is facing. And it dawned on me that it's not as simple as what I am facing on my day-to-day. I realized that when I was maybe about 8, 9 years old, as I walk back from my little playground, and don't imagine playground with a toy. It's just a little mound that for me acted like a hill where I ride my bicycle and a big tree. As I walk back, I kind of thought, how wonderful would it be to have a big patch of land where every plant from every corner of the globe could be put together. And at that point, of course, I do not understand biome. I do not understand ecosystems. But this is just children curiosity and desires to explore more, desire to understand more. And then people also sort of give me hints about illegal logging, about destructions that is happening. And one time when my family and I were driving from Banda Aceh to Medan, this is during the 90s. This is during the height of civil conflict. And we drive at night and we usually come through multiple checkpoints. And that evening, suddenly there's a traffic jam. Of course, there's never a traffic jam on the road that is so quiet. And then I asked my dad, why is there a traffic jam? And then he said, elephant crossing. And we have to be respectful and turn off the light. And turn off the engine of the car, allow the elephant to pass. These patches of information that sort of came to me as a kid and somehow digested into a desire on wanting to understand the natural world better. So when my dad asked, what do you want to study in university? I was like, biology, for sure.
But you studied marine biology. So why in the end, 'cause I know we're both scuba divers, or at least you're still a scuba diver. I was for many years a very enthusiastic amateur scuba diver. But you studied marine biology, and yet your whole life's work has been dedicated so far to rainforests. So how the switch?
when I graduate as a marine biologist in my 20s, I sort of went back to the patch of coral reef where I fell in love with the ocean the first time and see it bleach and destroyed. So it kind of break my heart thinking that this patch of reef in Pulawe is so remote at that time. This is back in 2007. This place is so remote. It's so underdeveloped. There's no big resort. There's no golf field. There's almost nothing. There's a tiny little chalet. There is a one dive shop. And yet the reef is destroyed because of changing climate, because of ocean acidification, because of sea temperature rise. And that make me feel powerless as an individual, make me feel what is the use of all my marine biology knowledge when there's no difference I can make. And because I feel powerless, it made me redirect and make me think, maybe there's something I can do for forests. Maybe forest protection is a little simpler. So that was me looking for a shortcut. But instead, I walked myself into an even bigger challenge. But yeah, now here I am.
Just describe for our listeners and viewers, if you would please, this Leuser ecosystem, because I said it was one of the most remarkable rainforests, because I think it's the only place now on Earth where you have in the wild rhinoceros and tigers and elephants and orangutan and so much more biodiversity. So just this, what's it like?
If you can imagine Indonesia have like 5 major islands, and one of the biggest island is Sumatra. Back in the days, Sumatra is completely covered in forests. It stretched from the northern tip in Banda Aceh all the way down in Lampung. It's full of forests. But in the past 3 and 4 decades, Sumatra have lost majority of its forests. And the only large patch of intact forest still left in Sumatra is located in the Leuser ecosystem in Aceh province. So these 2.7 million hectares of relatively intact rainforest that cover different type of ecosystems. You see from mountainous area to lowland forest with huge giant dipterocarp tree to deep pit swamp forests and mangroves. Leuser ecosystem have almost all of that. And of course, it is also home to the critically endangered Sumatran megafauna, the Sumatran tiger, orangutan, rhino, and elephant. If you think about the Sumatran megafauna, they used to spread across the island of Sumatra. But now their range have become so limited that the only area with high enough forest cover, high enough habitat viability, and high enough population density is only the Leuser ecosystem. I'm not saying that we shouldn't protect the forests. In the rest of Sumatra, we still should. We still need to recover many of forests left in other parts of Sumatra. But if we were to protect the population of this poor endangered megafauna, we need to protect the Leuser ecosystem. And with it, we would also be conserving other species that coexist in this landscape.
So you founded this NGO that has the shorthand of HACA, but I think stands for Forest and Nature and Environment in Aceh. Tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do with HACA.
First, I need to emphasize that the conservation and protection in Leuser did not begin with me. I come in as part of this very long history of people that been putting their life on the line to protect these ecosystems. The conservation of Leuser began even during colonial times, when the Acehnese elders asked the colonial government to not exploit the forests and the mountains that stretch from the river of Tripa to the river of Trumon. And this is way back in the 1930s, before Indonesian independence. And of course, when Indonesia get their independence, the forest conservation are not very high in their priority list. In the 70s, Indonesian government gazetted some of its early national park, and Leuser National Park was one of the first national park the Indonesian government created. And then fast forward to the 90s, in the 90s, there was a huge research that looked into wildlife distribution in Leuser. And when they look into it, they realize, oh my God, most of the wildlife in Leuser exists outside the national park. So then they created these new boundaries. They call it the Leuser Ecosystem to reflect the distributions and movement of wildlife. I created Haka along with my colleague in 2012. So we come much later in this picture. Many of my colleagues have had longer history of working for the conservation of Leuser ecosystem, including going through the process of iteration during the research, during creation of unit management Leuser, and many actors have put their life on this landscape. When we created Haka, the intention was to be an additional balancing force to keep government accountable. Because what we want and what we envision is a space where conservation of forests and prosperity of people come hand in hand. And what is not compatible in this space is when all the productive land given away to companies and concessions. When, we talk a lot about illegal logging, but what's more dangerous is the legal logging. When the government give out thousands and thousands of hectares to certain companies and hardly any local communities get the benefit out of that. And often when the companies operate, they give out the land within protected areas to local communities. And then local communities come into conflict with elephant, come into conflict with tigers. So when we created this organization, we intended to be an organization that would hold government accountable. So we choose 3 different pillars that we will run these organizations through. First is the campaign and advocacy to strengthen the policy that protect these ecosystems. Second, the use of technology to monitor changes in forest cover. It seems simple, but we realized that Indonesian government doesn't quite have enough satellite monitoring access for them to do the monitoring effectively. And third, we would empower community to have meaningful participation in the protection of forests. We come to better understand how communities do have a seat at the table, but that seat is often underutilized. So we work with these communities to re-engage them and for them to take ownership over that seat on the table. I hope that's not a long-winded answer.
No, that's really helpful. Now, I've had the advantage of hearing you speak before, so I know a little bit more of the detail, and obviously been preparing for our conversation now. But one of the really impressive things from my perspective was the way that you have been empowering women in those indigenous communities to become forest rangers. Now, I think another thing that our viewers and listeners need to know is that where you're operating is quite a conservative with a small c, very traditional faith-based communities. So this idea of empowering women as foreign rangers isn't a kind of a natural first step, is it?
It might not seem natural, but it actually is. So a lot of people do not realize that Aceh, even though it's very patriarchal and very conservative, it is also space where women historically have lived and have thrived. Some of the most famous national hero for independence from Aceh are women. They are Tun Mutia, they are Tun Nyadin. Some of the early, if we think back to the era of 1800, perhaps we would not imagine a female admiral that lead thousands of troops in the Navy that come from Aceh, Laksamana Malahayati. So Aceh do have very strong female character. We even joke that men sit around in a coffee shop talking politics, and it's the woman that work the field. It's the woman that run the household. It's the woman that run the economy. So if you understand the context of the region, it's not so weird to think that, woman came up as champion in this space. But yeah, of course, it is a very patriarchal, it's a very conservative society where we imagine the Islam conservatism put a lot of focus on women's outfit and limitations and their role within the household as if, but it's not 100% true. So when we come to the village and we speak to the woman, they are so incredibly animated. They show us so much of their knowledge because they are the one that interact closely with the environment. Of course, out of training, every time we ask them about their role, they tend to divert a little bit and say, oh yeah, we're following our husband, we're supporting our husband. I think they come to better understand that if they let the man ego win, they get away with a lot of things. So when we first train this group of women on environmental impact assessment and forest protection and their rights within the regulation, they come back to us and say that they want to be involved in forest protection. They want to be able to engage and stop deforestation and stop illegal logging. They said that back when we went out into the forest with our husband, and then we come across illegal loggers, and then we told them they shouldn't be illegal logging. The illegal logger challenged us, practically saying that, who are you and what are your authority? You are a nobody. And because of that particular context, then we work with them to provide them with legality in order to protect the forest. We work with them to obtain the permit from the government so they could protect the area, the forest area of their village. Once they did that, the ripple effect was immeasurable. So one of the men in the village, I asked him what is his perspective now that he see the woman in the village start patrolling into the forest. And then he said, I didn't expect that the woman would be so effective. They'll be so remarkable because they escalate conflict. So when they come across illegal loggers, instead of getting in a fight, they offer the illegal loggers coffee and they offered them food, and the illegal loggers would feel terrible and would eventually want to replant and protect the forest because, this elder woman make them feel so bad by being so kind. I was like, wow, that's amazing. I would not have imagined a male ranger do that. And then beyond that, they also said since the women feel empowered to be engaging in forest protection, they also feel empowered to sit in the village meeting. So instead of being in the meeting to serve coffee and food, they are there as active participant in the meeting. They demand allocations in the budget. They demand to see the village spatial plan. They engage in the development planning. I was like, wow, that's beyond what I envisioned could be possible. I thought it would just be cool for this woman to be rangers, but they take it so many levels.
Fantastic. Now, for me, one of the really interesting things, and you touched on it a moment ago, is this combination of on-the-ground, community-empowered activity, but also with some very modern technologies to be monitoring what's happening in terms of illegal logging and threats of deforestation. So can you just explain that second part of the strategy, this use of up-to-date technology?
Many of the technology to monitor changes in forest cover could be available in our phones. So we give it training to local communities to be able to utilize these technologies. For example, we use the Global Forest Watch technology. So there's an app that you could install on your phone. and you could put a layer of areas that you wanted to cover, and you could get a almost real-time alert when there is forest loss, when there is fires, when there are changes in the forest. So they could help for the rangers to plan their patrol. They would go to areas where threats persist, and they could then engage with the activities directly. Another interesting thing was when we did technology training using drones for this local community to see the area around the village. One of the big recent battle that we support local communities in Betong with was against gold mining. Gold companies, there's a mining companies that is operating upstream of the village. And then at that time, the local community didn't realize the scale of the destructions until they use this technology, and then they use drones. So when they fly the drone up, and then they get to witness how fast the mining area is, and that mobilizes community to then stop the companies from operating in that area, because that company do not have permits. That company has been operating illegally. But to be able to witness firsthand the scale of the destruction, bring and unite community together to push back against these mining companies.
And in terms of the use of that drone technology and that mobile phone app, which presumably links to satellite monitoring and things, does that take a lot of persuading to those local communities? I mean, I just think about my own kind of, it's some new technology. I'm not sure I'm going to be comfortable with all of this. So do you find some resistance from some of your forest rangers and others to say, Farwiza, we're happy to do this work, but now you're asking us to deal with all of these new technologies as well? Heavens.
Well, first of all, of course, we acknowledge that it's not possible to come into the community and train them once and expect them to be expert. I learned many things many times before I'm able to fluently execute any of the command. So we don't assume that, here's the training, here's some drone, and go. What happened normally is through multiple iterations of our engagement with local communities. So we work with 14 communities out of 14 villages, and each of them have different age range. They come from different demographics. They're facing different threats. Then on top of that, we also work with female paralegals that we have trained. There are over 200 female paralegals. And then we're also working with youth, giving them skill sets to run campaigns. So we do a lot of quite a bit of engagement with local communities that happen over time through repeated learning process. When we were trying to equip the local communities with drone technology and satellite monitoring, it's not something that we decide one-sidedly. It's something that comes through multiple trainings and feedback from the local community. During paralegal training, we give them the legal knowledge. We also taught them a little bit about evidence-based cases, legal cases, and how we could use what they called barefoot environmental impact assessment. So, you see with your eyes, the color of the river have changed. You smell with your nose how the air have become polluted. You feel it with your skin, the temperature changes. That could stand in court. And as part of that process, we introduce technologies to whoever who wants to sign up and go further into the trainings and go deeper. And then we create another trainings with technologies. So it's not, everybody come in and suddenly you all now have to be able to fly drones. That's not really the level of expectations we put in our communities.
Now, you're hinting there at what I understand is a kind of a fourth strand of hackers' work, which is also taking some cases to the courts as well. I think you won one quite major settlement a while back.
Yeah, it was quite an interesting perspective also to think about court cases in environmental protection in Indonesia. Of course, we tend to think if a company engage in illegal activities like burning forests, surely that's illegal. How could they continue to operate? In a whole lot of ways, Indonesian law enforcement are still quite weak in certain parts, and could do with a lot of supports from experts and civil society actors. Back in 2012, well, it's even further back, in 2010, our satellite monitoring found a company clearing land illegally. So at that time, this was before Haka. So at the time, my colleague at the Leuser Ecosystem Management Authority sent a letter to the government confirming, say, hey, we find this land clearing, is this legal? And then the government sent back, practically said this land clearing is without permit and therefore it's illegal. So then we file a report to the police, and then the police respond by saying, yes, this land clearing is without permit and therefore the company needs to be given permit. So not cool. And then between that process of police issuing that recommendation and governor issuing a new permit, that area have become an area that is off limit for new permit on Indonesian government map. So then that's like double illegal. When the new permit was issued, we then sue the permit. At that time, it was a civil society coalition, including Friends of the Earth. Haka also didn't exist at that time, that filed a lawsuit against this company. And during court proceeding, was months into court proceedings, suddenly the company decided to clear the land, use fire to clear the land. So then they show the level of acting with impunity that make us think that this company must have done this so many times. They must have been protected so often that they feel like they could be in court and burning the land without fear. So then we'll galvanize a campaign that bring in central government from Jakarta to run an investigation against this company. When they ran that investigation, they decide that this is clearly illegal, but we need to go through due process and file a case against this company. So it is the central government that filed the case against the company. They file a criminal case and they file a civil case. And they use an expert to calculate the loss that come from forest fires. Fast forward another year of court proceeding. We support them with experts, with evidence, with eyewitness, as well as the community witness. After a year of court proceedings, the government win. We all celebrated. The government win based on US dollars value at that time, 26 million US dollars. Now the number is a little bit smaller because Indonesian rupiah are so weak. 26 million US dollars in fine and restoration fee. That is the fines that the company should pay to the government. But then the company didn't. The company didn't even consider that they need to pay that fine. So they continued to stay in court. They keep, what do you call that process when you take it to a higher court?
Yep, they appealed. Yes.
Yeah, they appeal. So they appeal multiple times and they reapply for a fresh case. Each time they appeal failed in the Supreme Court, and that went on for a decade. Eventually, the company surrendered whatever the Indonesian government was doing to them. And eventually, after over a decade of campaign and push, they finally pay the fines to the government. So there's this misunderstanding. Oftentimes, people thought I win the case and the fund flowed through us, but it's not. We just supporting the government and doing the job. So the company, I'm not against any commodities or any companies. I just do not want companies they're doing something they should not do. Going into high biodiversity area, destroying forests in pit swamps, destroying forests in elephant corridors. If the companies exist outside these areas that needs to be protected, I'm not going to touch them.
And that's part of the bigger challenges that you and organizations like Hacker face, I'm imagining, every day, because on the one hand, you are trying to preserve what's left of the rainforests, which are so important for humanity, and so much of the biodiversity that's within them. And at the same time, you have some who are saying, we've got more important priorities. We've got to create jobs and economic activity and economic development for our country, and seeing these have to be in tension. I think what you're trying to do is to show, no, they don't have to be in tension. They don't have to always be in conflict. And can you just tell us a little bit about some of the ways you're trying to show that actually the protection of the rainforests, like the Leuser ecosystem, can in fact contribute to economic development of Indonesia too?
For decades, we have been what feels like yapping about the importance of conservation for economic development. For decades, we've talked about one of the primary roles of rainforests to protect life and livelihood by preventing disasters like floods and landslides. In November 2025, a cyclone swept through Sumatra. And because of that cyclone met with sensitive land and disappearing forest cover, what we ended up seeing is a huge flash floods and landslides. So much timber that has been logged then become weaponized as huge amount of water came down and bringing everything that is with it. So we see huge rivers clogged with hundreds of tons of logs, some still with roots, some without, some cleanly clad. And it shows clearly how historical deforestation have weakened the land structure and then add to the risk of disasters. When we look at the three provinces impacted by the flash flood in November 2025, it's Aceh, North Sumatra, and West Sumatra. Aceh have the highest forest cover, but Aceh also see the worst impact of the disasters. People tend to think, is there a recent deforestation that happened in that area? In reality, we have known that Aceh land are incredibly sensitive, that since 2007, multiple analyses have shown that Aceh cannot afford to lose any more forests if it were to have a prosperous economic growth. By losing more forests, it add disaster risk to this province. And of course, at that time, government did not listen to the warning of the experts. You hear like every disaster movie start, government not listening to the scientists. In 2025, we witnessed the predictions that has been read into multiple times for multiple years. Recent assessment and looking at the recovery costs for the floods, it amounts to probably about $30 billion. And interestingly, it was exactly the number that came out in the assessment about the value of forests, the value that the forest contributes to the economy in terms of flood prevention. So the number match. This is something that we have calculated. This is something that we have known, and somehow we refuse to listen. We continue to allow the kind of economic development that rely on exploitation, that rely on the destructions of forests, and eventually lead to the destructions of life and human life. The initiatives that we do with local community are tiny compared to the scale of the disasters, compared to the scale that is needed. But I am hopeful that we learn a thing or two from these disasters, that we could transition our economic activities to be conservation leaning instead of exploitation leaning. We need to add value into commodities that we have. We need to work with local communities to better understand what works for them instead of keep focusing on giving investment opportunities for large corporations that would employ very few people and taking a lot of land. So we are currently working on one of the green economic opportunities on a master plan for the Leuser master plan of ecotourism for Aceh and for the Leuser ecosystems, because we could have high value ecotourism that would be employment intensive, but also respectful to the wisdom of local communities in the area who knows the lands best. We also work with local community, with smaller community economic empowerment through alternative commodities like honey, forest honey, rattan, coffee, as well as more recently communities in palm oil areas in Tenggulun work on mushrooms. So they collaborate with the technology companies called Mycelia, Indonesian technology companies, to create leather from fungi using palm oil waste. So there's like multiple experiment that we are running on. But of course, as a conservation organizations, we need a lot of help and a lot of guidance when it comes to economic enhancement. It's not something that I'd say our forte.
But that's talking about very practically on the ground. How do you make these kind of big concepts of the just transition, how that really can work on the ground? Because you've got palm oil, which is such an incredibly critical part of global supply chains for food and detergents and cosmetics and all kind of retail products. And you've got 60% of all of the palm oil that's used in the world coming from Indonesia. So there's a big established economic set of models there. And what you and other organizations like HACU are trying to do is to show, well, yes, you can have sustainable production of palm oil, and at the same time, we can show practical ways that we can make a just transition happen on the ground. What's the biggest challenges for you in making progress on that?
I think at this moment in time, the biggest challenge is the readiness of the market, the financial structure, and the government mindset. What I mean by that is, for a person, if they came to financial institutions wanting to take loan for, say, 10 hectares of palm oil plantations, it's much easier for them than if they were to take loan for something like agroforestry. The trust from the financial institutions is much smaller for activities like agroforestry, or what would be more conservation leaning. What we are hoping to achieve in our collaborations with the government is to strengthen the spatial plan, because every areas need a blueprint for development. So to work with the government to allow activities happen where it's supposed to happen. So palm oils in the areas that is already degraded, that is further away from wildlife habitats and corridors, and reduce the likelihood of conflict. And we're also working with companies to prevent further deterioration and further conflict in places where they already have concessions, for them to conserve parts that can and need to be conserved. Just transition is a very long-term perspective, a very long-term view in reimagining a future where we don't set ourselves on the path of destructions. We tend to look back into the past and think about, when communities are telling me before palm oil companies move in, we can get enough protein from our rivers. We can get enough protein from these waters because they exist in a pit swamp. But since the palm oil companies move in, of course, they build canals, they set up factories, the rivers become polluted. And now the local communities, even if they're earning more from working at the companies, all of the resources is spent because they don't have any other source of food. So there's a change in culture, there's a change in how society arrange and organize themselves. Just transitions is something that we need to work in collective with so many other actors. We work with businesses to clean up their supply chain in the Leuser ecosystem to make sure they don't source from areas that is recently deforesting. We work with brands and companies, get them to inform the government what businesses today care about, because consumers today care more about sustainability. So then creating all these different threads and pulling them together with the hope that eventually it would lead into a transition that we would like to see in the future.
If you could speak to the board of a multinational company that was or is sourcing a lot of palm oil from Southeast Asia, from in Indonesia, what would your messages be to such a board right now?
Interestingly, I did once. I sat at the table with the decision makers of some of the biggest companies in Indonesia at that time. And there's one CEO, he said that one time my daughter came to me with a piece of paper that say 100 top killers in the country. And my name was on it. And my daughter asked me, "Dad, are you proud?" This person was a CEO of a coal mining company. And his company is creating so much pollution. It's one of the top polluters that so many people get health implications that eventually lead to early death. That moment with his daughter then troubled him so much that he decided to change how the company operates. He decided to invest more in technologies like carbon capture and storage. And now he is working to transition the companies into clean energy and away and phase out their coal operation. It got me realize that perhaps what I need is not necessarily an airtime with the board of these companies, but airtime with their sons and daughters. Because all of us care more about people that is closest to us. Perhaps my voice would not change their mind, would not bend their logic because I'm a nobody to them. But if their sons and daughters care, the next generation care, maybe we have a chance that they would care.
Gosh, you took me back there for 20 years to the time when I was with Business in the Community in the UK, and we arranged a special showing of Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth, and we invited lots of the leading CEOs of the member companies of Business in the Community, and we said, there's one condition: you must bring a son or a daughter or a nephew or a niece to the showing when you come to this special showing in a fancy cinema in Leicester Square in the heart of London. And after the film was shown, and we started having a discussion in the auditorium, facilitated discussion. And when it really got interesting was when lots of those sons and daughters started to have the confidence to speak up and speak out. And you could just palpably feel the shift in that auditorium, and how lots of these CEOs were suddenly, having been, sort of quite, sort of on message, and their PR folk would have been happy with them. Suddenly you could see shifting rather uncomfortably when the sons and daughters of their peers, or even their own sons or daughters, were starting to speak up about some of these issues. So I think, how do you get that next generation voice into the room? But I mean, you are part of that next generation voice yourself. We're almost out of time, but I'd just like to sort of look ahead 20, 30 years, because my sense is that this is your lifelong vocation. And when you and I met, you'd just come back from New York, where you'd been helping to launch the planetary health checks with the late, great Jane Goodall. I think it was just a couple of days or so before she very sadly passed. And there was somebody who devoted her life to conservation in a different way, but a great resounding figure in conservation. If you sort of were looking back 20, 30 years from now on what had been the arc of the hacker journey, of Farwiza's journey, what do you hope that collectively humankind will be able to say we changed during that period? Not just, of course, because of you and Hacker, but because lots of other folk also got involved.
David, I just had this very interesting exercise simulations a couple of days ago. It called Deep Time and Seventh Generation. And the idea is we were separated into groups. Some of us are ancestors from the present, and some of us the seventh generation 200 years from now. And the seventh generation asked us questions that got us, the ancestors, to reflect of our time right now. And one of the questions really struck me, because the seventh generation said, ancestors, I heard during your time, the earth is on the brink of extinction, and the air is polluted, and the water is clogged with plastics, and people were divided into extremes. Is that true? What did you experience? And as we answered that question, it got us to imagine a future when that is no longer the case. The air is no longer polluted. The rivers are no longer clogged. That we are united and people feel safe amongst each other. And to paint a picture of such future that is possible through the collective imagination and the collective work of all of us, trying to do our part little by little to see a future where the planet is healthy, where we coexist in harmony, and believing that perhaps it's not one giant turn, but many small ones that brought us to a different alternate futures than the trajectory we're currently heading into right now.
And we talk a lot about forecasting, but actually what you've just described brilliantly in your exercise in Malaysia is a great illustration of backcasting, to start from what's the desired goal, and then what were the steps that had to be taken in order to achieve that desired goal. Apart from doing lots of podcasts like this and sharing your experiences with audiences in different parts of the world, Farwiza, how are you trying to inspire other people who maybe, are the marine biologists just finishing their training today, but realize that they in order to ensure that those remaining coral reefs aren't bleached, they do need to go back to some of the earlier source problems. What's your message for the immediate next generation?
The message for the immediate next generation, even though a lot feels bleak at times and seemingly out of your hands and out of your control, believing that us as individuals do have power on a little bit that we can do. So look around and think about what is it that is within my power to change. It could be myself, it could be my circle, it could be my friends, it could be my family. And slowly, before you know it, that circle would have expanded. And you look around and you're like, wow, I'm surrounded by these very powerful communities of people that is driving change. I am part of that alternative wave that want to bring the trajectory of our future somewhere different, somewhere better, somewhere peaceful.
Curse the darkness or light the candle. Absolutely, I'm with you 100% on that. Farwiza, it's been a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you today. Wishing you every continued success in your work, and look forward to staying in contact. But for now, thank you very much.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me, David.
Thank you.